Right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Updates in Pediatrics live stream. Updates in Pediatrics is a monthly live stream program which takes place on the third Wednesday of the month at noon. Participants will receive a link following the program for an evaluation. You can also use the QR code that will be displayed following the program today, and that way you can get your CME credit. I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Dan Florell. Dr. Florell is a professor at the University of Kentucky, or Eastern Kentucky, and runs a private practice in school psychology. Dr. Florell obtained his PhD in school psychology from Illinois State University. He is a nationally certified school psychologist, a licensed psychologist, and an APA fellow. He has trained school psychologists in a graduate program for the last 20 years. His main research focus is on cyberbullying, technology, telehealth, professional issues, and the history of school psychology. So welcome, Dr. Florell, and he is going to talk to us about social media use and problems in youth. I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Florell.
I want to thank you all for inviting me to come on in and talk about a topic that I imagine you have quite a bit of interface with, given the clientele that you deal with on a day-to-day basis. I do have some insights into pediatricians, as I'm married to one, and she oftentimes tells me a lot of the things that are going on in her practice and some of the interactions she has. So what I'm hoping to do today is really just give you a good idea of what adolescents are typically using social media-wise, some of the implications of that, some of the things that may end up showing up in your neck of the woods, and a little bit of idea of how to go about treating those issues. I'm not sure, I think there was some flashes ahead of time about this, but this is my little disclosure statement that I don't own any of these companies. If I did, probably wouldn't be speaking here. I'd be laughing in luxury with all the millions they've made. So no conflicts of interest or any sort of thing like that. So on this update screen, you can see the little monster there, and then you can see, hopefully, and identify what most of those icons relate to. I will say that some of them are going to be easy, like Facebook, because that's been around for eons now, on all of 15 years. Twitter also seems to be in the news fairly frequently, along with YouTube. And if you were in pandemic lockdown, TikTok, which is on the far left there, is hard to miss. Others, though, may not be as familiar to you, things like Discord, which is that kind of top one towards the left on the blue, or the ghost is Snapchat, which many of you may also be familiar with. It's always hard to tell. I know there's a big range in everybody's social media experience. So I'm going to assume you know just a moderate to minimal level. And then, of course, you know more. You can just be surprised. So learning objectives here, I'm not going to go over those in great detail, but this is kind of the idea of what I want you to get out of the next 45 minutes or so. And then, of course, ask all the questions that you can, and we'll try to answer some of those towards the end about some of the social media usage. And I think the important thing to know with almost all of our clients past the age, it seems like, of 8 or 9 years old, is pretty much everybody has access to content. This is the rate of smartphone ownership between 8 to 18-year-olds, and you can see the increase in age. So now even 8-year-olds, almost a third, have smartphones. And so it suffices to say a lot of them have access to all the same content that you and I do. And obviously at those ages, that's a bit concerning, because some of the things that are modeled there are not really developmentally appropriate and may lead to some behaviors that end up in your office. And then, of course, in teenage, pretty much everybody these days has smartphones, much to the chagrin of a lot of teachers, because when they get bored, they'll just go on and watch TikTok videos as opposed to learning more about chemistry or other topics. And I should say, this is one of the two big sources that I got for a lot of the usage. Common Sense Media, if you're unfamiliar with it, tremendous resource in regards to a lot of media oriented towards youth. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that, it's a nonprofit and has a lot of good information. So that's one of the two sources, and they just literally came out with some of these usage figures not even a year ago. As far as the influences, and we'll look on a little more detail These are the big names in the game to be kind of familiar with. And then I threw a couple of up-and-comer ones that you may start hearing a little bit, or they may end up being nothing. It's sometimes hard to tell which of these media platforms are going to take off and which ones are fairly short-term. So one of the big things, though, to kind of think about is that social media typically also includes YouTube and TikTok, and those are by far the most popular. And we'll see that with the numbers in the next few slides. So if you think about it, I think the equivalent for most of us growing up is you basically have access to every single show that was available on any sort of TV channel, and all the stuff that was not allowed on TV channels, you now have access to. And it's all in the palm of your hand and can be accessed in a minute. So I think that's real important when we talk about the information that a lot of these, especially teenagers, are coming in and accessing, and that we are expected maybe to all of a sudden kind of have this information sprung on us, and you know, wondering where did they get that from. So the other thing that shows that things are real popular, especially on TikTok, is that both Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, they've all adopted these short video links, which are called shorts or reels, depending on which platform you're on. And of course, as they say, you know, somebody copying is the sincerest form of flattery. And so believe me, everybody is very admirable of TikTok, because they all have these kind of short versions of videos trying to get some of that. They've also found that if kids are watching videos, they stay on the platform much longer than they would if they were just chatting with friends or looking at pictures like on Instagram. So that's why you see this massive movement to video content on really all the platforms, even though YouTube and TikTok are kind of the main games. I'm not going to really get into it as much, but online gaming certainly shouldn't be ignored, especially among boys and adolescent boys too. There's a lot of time, and that's a lot of times where they're doing some of their socialization. So when we start talking about online gaming, Discord has been linked to that very closely, because Discord is kind of an online chat mechanism that really started out of the gaming world. So kids would have, you know, on one side their Discord going so they could chat with the people that they were playing the interactive game with. They've been trying to broaden that, but when we look at the usage scales, Discord is probably one of those raising kind of social media platforms. And then you have Be Real, which is, like to say, if you want to be a little ahead of the curve, Be Real might be one that you should be at least a little knowledgeable about. It was really hot this summer. I don't know if it's continued that upward trajectory, but it's oftentimes referred to as kind of the anti-Instagram. The whole premise of this, for those of you unfamiliar with Be Real, is that it will buzz you randomly at some point during the day, and you're supposed to get out your phone and take a picture, a two-way picture of both you and then whatever you're in front of. And it's supposed to be like a slice of life where you're not supposed to be able to primp and change your photos and do all of that. And they put in numerous safeguards to try to assure that you are, quote, being real. And so that really took off, and a lot of college students, and I've heard high school students, are now getting into the Be Real. So if you want to refer to something that maybe even the adolescents haven't quite heard of yet, and be for once ahead of the curve, because like myself, I'm sure many of you feel like you're perpetually behind the curve, Be Real might get you there. So those are some of the platforms. Let's kind of look at the popularity of each of these, because these may have changed from what you maybe assume. So you can see on the left here, and this is the Pew Research Center, who literally came out probably less than a month ago with these figures, and they only come out once every few years. So really glad between that and the Pew Research study that we have that kind of user data. But as you can see here, 2014, Facebook was ruling the roost by far, with over 71% of teenagers using it. And now you see it's almost half that amount just 5 short years later, whereas Instagram's kind of retained its popularity and Snapchat has really increased. And believe it or not, 5 years ago, there was no such thing as TikTok, and they didn't even look at YouTube, which by far YouTube is the most popular. You can see they're 95% accessing it, followed not too far behind by TikTok. And then you can see some other things like Twitter has really kind of lost some of its appeal in regards to that. And then the rest of them, Tumblr, Reddit, Twitch. Reddit and Tumblr, those are kind of old school kind of media feeds or discussion bulletin board kind of thing. Wouldn't find that overly appealing, I think, for most teenagers. And Twitch is the video game streaming platform. So it's basically video of people playing video games, which is also, by the way, a very popular YouTube to watch, which I have met a lot of parents and they just kind of shake their head, you know, wondering like, they're not even playing the game. What's the appeal here? Now, the other important thing to ask, and I have both of these surveys, the Common Sense one and the Pew Internet one, have asked them a little differently. And it's not just, have you ever used these platforms, but which ones do you use the most, or which ones could you not live without? And as you can see across the stage there, everybody agrees among these adolescents that YouTube is where it's at, and they would rather not be able to deal with it. Instagram, interestingly, while a lot of people use Instagram, they don't find it quite as integral or as important to them in their social media usage, whereas things like TikTok and Snapchat have a little bit more of a following. And then you can see Discord there quickly following up. And you notice all the way down there is Facebook. So if they have Facebook, and I've talked to my college classes too, Facebook is for grandma, grandpa, you know, and making sure to put your best self out there because that's what they're using. And then your real self is more on Snapchat, maybe a little bit on Instagram. So that's kind of the way that a lot of adolescents view Facebook these days. It's really on the outs. Even Instagram's starting to lose some influence. And then the Pew Research study, you can see here, about half of them said it would be hard to give up social media. So, you know, some of the interventions that we'll talk about, maybe finding them other outlets in addition to social media and spending their downtime. I think some of it's just a lack of exposure. You know, there's this nervous tendency, especially after the pandemic, in regards to social interactions in person. They don't know what to do with the silences, and they're not very skilled with their social interactions because they haven't been doing it a whole lot. And so that what they do as a nervous reaction is they go to their phone right away to try to get on social media or watch the latest videos, and they don't interact with each other much. I constantly see this in my undergraduate classes. I've taught long enough, I can remember when they all used to, eventually about this time of the semester, would be friends with one another. And now I think they're just as much as strangers as they were from the very first day, because if there's downtime, they're just on their phones. And it's like deathly quiet. I almost wish it could get that quiet in the library. And so I think some of our efforts may be just letting parents know, you know, what other sorts of opportunities, or, you know, have you put a little bit of restrictions in to kind of force them to see there's other aspects of life that are very very rewarding, not to ban it totally, but just to say it's rewarding. And you can see even teenagers themselves kind of realize, like, I need more in my life. I'm on social media too much, with a third of them indicating that. And then the way that they asked in regards to the social media usage in this particular survey was, did they ever use, and then do they use it almost constantly or use this site often? And once again, it's the same trend, even if the numbers are just a tad different, with YouTube, once again, by far most popular, followed by TikTok and Instagram, where Facebook has really fallen off quite a bit. As far as age breakdowns, what we're seeing now is that social media is growing among 8 to 12-year-olds, probably corresponding with the fact that at least a third of 8 to 12-year-olds have their own smartphone. So they have immediate access. And even though there's supposed to be restrictions on social media, I've been told by many, it's as simple as lying about your age. So if you're smart enough as an 8 or 9-year-old to put a date that's just old enough for you to qualify, you can get an account too, oftentimes without your parents even being aware of it. And you can see not a majority by any means, but at least a significant minority of these 8 to 12 kind of tweens are using it almost every day. Now that juxtaposed to teens who spend at least an hour and a half a day on the social media, but once again, feeling kind of conflicted about it and maybe not necessarily enjoying it all the time, though a third really do get into it. So another question that you probably get frequently, I certainly do in my work as a psychologist, is, they're on it all the time. This can't be healthy. And as you can see, these are the trends over a 6-year period that Common Sense has done their surveys, and it's just an ever increasing amount of entertainment screen use, probably peaking in 2021, because frankly, what else were we going to do during the pandemic? But it does indicate that the norm of usage is steadily creeping upward. And so when we get into problematic usage, I don't know if we can for certain say like, oh, if they exceed 3 hours, then that's too much. It's a little too simple, because screen usage, a lot of it has to do with academics now, right? Schools are requiring it. And if they're interacting with friends, that's not necessarily a bad thing. So the type of and the way that you view things can really predict whether something's too much. But going back to the age-old qualification for psychological disorders, what sort of impact is it having on their daily lives? If family life's being disrupted, if they're not able to or don't spend any time with friends, they're, failing school, that's too much, whatever that amount is. If they're able to balance all that and still, have 6 or 7 hours that they are on using their social media, then, it's probably okay. I won't say that that would be my ideal, but it's not what we would think of as an addiction or anything like that. So, I think the big thing that we want to emphasize, and if parents are looking for advice or if teenagers are listening to us, is to really think about moderation. Because the mismatch is, the parents, of course, most of them not having grown up with smartphones, view being on it for more than a couple hours a day is too much after that. Whereas kids, since they carry it everywhere, it's like every down moment they're using it. They don't even think of it, how often that they're using it. And they're not going to be looking any different than, say, their friends do. So among their peer group, they're going to seem average. But of course, from the parents' view, that's something that's more problematic. And so that emphasis on not the amount of time, but the consequence of that use needs to be really what it is. And the offering alternatives also, and not just continually letting the teenagers or the younger kids just stay on it for hours and hours, and encouraging to go play a sport, go on a walk, do other sorts of activities that can be very enjoyable, play an instrument for that matter. But staring at screens, I don't think after a while is going to be very fulfilling, and that's what we saw earlier in some of that survey outcome. So gross measures of screen time aren't going to predict negative outcomes. How that social media is used is really going to matter. So if I am interacting with friends, if I am actively engaging in posts, usually that's associated with better mental health. And that's because it's mimicking more the social interactions that we have on a day-to-day basis. And most kids' interactions are going to be with in-person friends. It's not usually with friends they've just met on the internet. And so, that's going to just strengthen some of those relationships. So in some cases, for kids that aren't able to get together with their friends outside of school, something like a boy getting on and playing an online game with his friends where they can interact through the game is sometimes that's the socialization, that time that they have, and the activity they're bonding over just happens to be online. So rather than trying to roll back that usage, it's probably okay. Now, on the flip side, if the people are just kind of passively scrolling through the social media feeds and just watching video after video after video, that is not really committing and interacting. That is just really feeding the time. And that's where you see the higher rates of anxiety, but especially depression and loneliness kind of come through. In particular, as we'll be talking about, seeing how awesome everything else is on social media, and your life is in comparison very bland and boring, and you're the only one that's feeling that way. So that's kind of the negative impact that we see about the screen time. And this goes to a little prior point too, is, are they enjoying these activities they're spending so much time in? The people with online videos, like with TikTok and stuff, yes, it seems like at least 2/3 are really enjoying it, and it seems to cross boundaries from those young 8 to 12-year-olds all the way up into adolescence. So this is why, of course, all the social media companies are really trying to desperately get kind of a handle on that and have more people come to their platform. Video games, you can see the video game appeal tends to be a lot higher with tweens than you do with video games as far as enjoying it a lot. And then social media, it's kind of the flip, but even social media with adolescents, which is the high end, you're only seeing a third. So once again, I think sometimes it's maybe because it's the norm that everybody's interacting on these social medias, that a lot of kids out there are feeling almost mandated to do so. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why they may feel like they have to use something, even if they don't particularly like it a whole lot. And there's something to do with the social media companies too, kind of getting that way. If you've ever felt like you've extended doing an activity longer, but you somehow feel obliged to finish it or whatever it might be. Excuse this, they're doing a weekly or a monthly kind of cut down in my office as far as crisis stuff. It's just a test. Apologies. So as far as enjoying it, social media is not the big thing. It's all these online videos, which once again, if we know that's where their sources of information are, it can help inform us as we maybe try to give them better information on whatever topic those teenagers and younger children are looking at. Now, I didn't want to be everything on social media, let's just bash it kind of presentation here. So I did find an article that really looked at and asked adolescents, like, why are you using this? You know, what's the good things out of it? And so, you know, I think the original purpose of social media was to connect better with other people, with friends and family. So I think, unfortunately, the pandemic kind of belied that that isn't as effective as many people think it is. Some of the other things you see here, you know, going and participating in group school projects, there's a lot of that. Once again, hard to meet maybe in person, so they're able to do that more effectively at home through social media. Getting that emotional support from others. So the same thing that typical friendships would provide, they're doing it, but they're just doing it using technology. Of course, if you want to be active in your community, know about cultural issues, you know, a lot of that's going to be where we maybe previous generations may have looked in a paper or something. This is going to be an online through the various posts that may be made out there. And it also allows them to get more involved in the community. I'm kind of amazed at the things. I have two teenage daughters. I'm amazed at the stuff that they find out is going on. And a lot of that they got through social media. So it does have some virtues there. Other things, you know, that I was alluding to a little bit earlier about building relationships and extending that peer support, especially, once again, a lot of our kids are living far apart from one another. The days where you could just go a neighborhood or two over to visit a friend, it's a lot harder to do. And so media is the way that they're getting to it. I thought it was interesting when they said assist in protecting their mental health and a source of mental health information. So I know pediatric practices have been inundated with the rate of anxiety and depression that you're seeing in your clients. I certainly am as a child and adolescent psychologist. And so I've had more than a few come to me, and some of the reasons they came is that, yes, I was watching TikTok and, you know, they were talking about these symptoms. I think I may have this too. So in some ways, it's a real positive. And I do think it's part of the reason that we see a lot more openness in regards to mental health problems among this generation that we haven't seen in previous generations, so that the stigma is somewhat lessening. And a lot of times I even see the teenagers being the ones kind of dragging the parent to get them help. You know, I'll hear often at my clients, the parents will say, yeah, she said she wanted this. She wanted to come in and get this answered about herself. So I think social media in many ways is opening eyes in a positive way, though of course there's very little vetting of the accuracy of that mental health information. And so that's where I think we as professionals come in to try to get a better idea of what they've been told and what they think in regards to certain mental health disorders. And then of course the peer support is also valued, like it always is at that age. And social media can oftentimes provide that. So those are some of the positives, but of course, you're here to probably hear more about the dangers. And so some of the things you might be seeing, you know, eye strain and sleep problems. You know, the internet never rests, and when parents go to bed, if I can sneak my phone out and they're not very vigilant about it, I could be up much of the night watching videos or other things like that. So as part of my standard kind of questions, I always ask about sleep and try to get a better idea, because it's amazing how many psychological problems come when you're operating on 4 hours or less of sleep, especially in adolescence. It can help isolate yourself from your family, depending on your interactions. And once again, teenagers not usually ones that are actively going to seek out their parents. A lot of times they're holed up in their room, and so that they may feel somewhat disconnected. There is the issue of privacy and theft of personal information. So even the stuff that I was talking about, like Be Real, well, you're taking a unplanned photo of both your face and then also whatever you're facing. And it could be very easy to put information out there that you don't necessarily want to be out there. And a lot of teenagers are not necessarily going to be screening that closely for everything that they post, because many of them post quite a bit. The other aspect of what compels people to continue to use, even if they're not finding it enjoyable, is this anxiety of not fitting in or missing out on other people's activities and things. If they're not aware, then somehow they're going to be left out of the social circle, like when they get to school the next day. And so even when they're doing something enjoyable, they may feel compelled to have to check social media to make sure there's not something even better that they're missing out on. Of course, the cruel irony being that they don't get to enjoy the fun thing that maybe they're currently in, because their mind's perpetually kind of searching for what else might be going on. What is it, something that I'm missing? So they refer to that as FOMO, or fear of missing out. And I think you continue to see that as probably one of the contributors to some of the anxiety we're seeing. It also will be something that we'll tap into when we get into cyberbullying here in the next couple of slides. And then we also have the burgeoning sexuality of adolescents, and the encouragement of sexting, which can be more sexually explicit communications, including videos with being naked and doing other things. And that obviously can influence and be a negative influence on overall behavior. And we'll see some of the implications from that here in a minute. Some other dangers to mental health, just the higher usage or being on all the time does increase the risk for both internalizing and externalizing problems, mainly when individuals are engaging in a lot of social comparison. So the cruel part of social media is most people are only going to be posting their most perfect selves, and in many cases, with all the filters, they're unrealistic selves, because there's no way they look like that in real life. But if all you're doing is scrolling and seeing all these people, and then you compare that to your real self, you're probably going to compare fairly negatively. And so that's where you see that increase in anxiety or depression kind of creep in. You can also see the negative feedback that people maybe receive when they do post things. And it may even be fairly mild, but yet they take it in a very significant way, because as we know with adolescents, this is an age where they're very vulnerable to feedback from others. They're still figuring out who they are as a person, and that makes them less resilient in many ways. Not to mention, they just don't have the experience in being able to cope effectively with some of this feedback. And of course, some of it can get quite nasty, because a lot of social media can be anonymous. And so a lot of people can kind of pile on, and the person maybe doesn't even know who they are, but then just kind of takes it into themselves. And that kind of goes to also that risky self-presentation. So, putting yourself out there, putting out content, much more positive correlation. In other words, the more risky kind of content you put out there, the higher likelihood that you have of developing more internalizing kind of problems, and not so much the externalizing kind of problems. So internalizing being, of course, depression, anxiety, things like that, where externalizing is more kind of your ADHD, conduct problems, oppositional defiance, and things like that. So more explicitly, and you all may remember, just less than a year ago, Frances Hogan came out and kind of did a big whistleblower regarding what Facebook knew about the influence of Instagram, particularly on young girls. And really what this is the effect of these curated images that you can unnaturally put into a point where that beauty standard is almost unattainable. And when you're talking about vulnerable adolescent girls, that's going to make it even worse. So some of the big risk factors is, of course, watching and looking at a lot of these pictures is going to warp what you see as normal, and then also how you compare to that. It does tend to be a little higher risk factor for adolescent girls, and doing this, what they call upward social comparison. So typical social comparison, we would look at a peer and say, how do I compare to them? Upward social comparison would be like, I'm going to look at this star athlete or this model or somebody like that, and how do I compare? And if you have a tendency to do that, you're always going to be found wanting. And then, of course, if you're battling a higher body mass index yourself, that's going to make it more susceptible to doing that. And so when you get all of this, you're bombarded with all these perfectly curated images. Your body, as it's still undergoing change, is not going to conform to that ideal. Then you're going to see the development of body image issues, and at its more extreme, you're going to see eating disorder behavior. You know, this is why if you're going to be talking to clients or parents, kind of finding out what sort of platform are the clients using and how long are they looking, and are they more looking or is it more to interact with some friends? And the more that they're just kind of looking, the more you probably want to probe about eating disorders and their diet and how they view themselves, and try to head off any sorts of concerns of eating disorders down the road. As we know, eating disorders and eating disorder treatment, it's hard to get, and it's very hard to kind of kick once those disorders and kind of get their claws into mostly those adolescent girls. So, and the fact that Facebook has known and had this research for several years, and now you're beginning to just see an onslaught. You can see some of the sources there. I stopped at 4 or 5, but there were a ton more that have all come out here in the last 3 or 4 years in regards to viewing these things on social media and how that's impacting girls in particular regarding their body image and eating disorders. Another pretty prevalent issue that a lot of adolescents and children are dealing with is cyberbullying. This is nothing new. It's been around as long as social media has been around, and I've been presenting it in 3-hour workshops for well over 14 years. So unfortunately, we're not seeing it get any better despite the fact that it's been around for so long. So, you know, cyberbullying is really just kind of that bullying taken electronic format with some major caveats, because you can do things online that you can't do necessarily in person. But social media is going to be one of the major conduits where cyberbullying is going to occur. You're not seeing it as much, you know, people aren't certainly calling one another, and they probably aren't texting so much. They're going to go through the Snapchat or Instagram accounts. For a while there, Instagram was one of the major areas of cyberbullying. You could also even do it through TikTok videos or YouTube videos. Very easy to get that sort of stuff set up. So the Cyberbullying Research Center, a couple researchers that have been doing that a long time, have been once again using this fairly large sample of 13 to 17-year-olds, and you can see the rates there. The victimization rates are much higher, especially 2021, because once again we are captured all at home. Now, as far as the offenders, I don't know how accurate it is in 2021 or these generation, now that cyberbullying's been around so long, they've gotten the message that they shouldn't be doing these things. And so when asked, they kind of say, oh, no, I don't do it. And the number's actually a little higher. That would kind of be my guess. But what you can see from this is 1/4 of the kids walking into your offices will have experienced at least some form of cyberbullying over time. That doesn't mean that they're going to all have more significant reactions to it, because those that have higher social kind of networks to kind of spread out and buffer some of the impact of that aren't going to have the same mental health outcomes. But for a lot of them, you're going to see that typical depression and anxiety. You may even see some irritability. Of course, academic difficulties, anytime you hear that, your ears ought to perk up. And I would immediately start asking some about social media with academic difficulties, because a lot of times they're the canary in the coal mine as far as indicators of something being wrong. And it's probably more than maybe having a learning disability, especially if you get into your teenage years. And then it's more extreme, you might see higher suicidal ideation and maybe even attempts, though that would be relatively infrequent compared to the others like depression, anxiety kind of showing up there. Now, some other things that you might notice is an increasing in self-harm. Now, that is not to be confused for suicide attempts. Self-harm is kind of its own thing, and it doesn't necessarily lead to higher likelihood of suicide attempts. A lot of times, it's more of an expression of depression and a feeling of numbness to everything, and they do it to feel something. And so in the research that I was looking through, it looks like sexting is probably the major contributor to increased self-harm. So if you see some self-harm, that may be an area that you want to ask a bit more about. But there also is about cyberbullying, either the victim or the person that is doing it, the perpetrator or offender of the cyberbullying. So that's another thing to kind of think about. And then others who are just hooked into that internet gaming. And of course, a lot of those games are meant, the way they make money is the more that you use them. And so they're going to use all the psychological tricks that we know of to try to engross their audience. And even if they're not enjoying it, they need to level up or whatever the equivalent is in that game. And you can see where they become just kind of shells of themselves in a lot of ways. The other thing about self-harm and even suicide is that there are video sites out there that do the exact opposite of what we want, where that may even encourage or inform people how to do these particular behaviors, and maybe engaging in self-harm and how do you hide it. It's amazing what you can YouTube. If you YouTube and type in your query just the right way, they're going to be able to find a lot of these kind of things. And so you may be seeing more prevalence of this because it can be shared through social media and the knowledge in regards to that than you did maybe 10, 15 years ago. And a lot of it could be harder to find just because you won't have necessarily dedicated websites like you used to, but more just these random videos that if you're not searching for the right terms that you may never even know are out there. There are also this extremist attitudes. Now, this isn't going to maybe be something that people are going to come into the pediatrician for, but just something to be aware of, especially, just the extremist kind of videos. And once the algorithms start sending you particular information, you find that it will send more and more of that information if you happen to click on it. So not even intending to, you may get into these extreme attitudes that maybe at the most extreme you see with things like QAnon or extremist religious views. But you also had recently this man named Andrew Tate, where he's there, really known for a lot of misogynistic videos on a lot of the social media platforms. It kind of came out of nowhere. I was convinced. I have a couple college students that are helping me out in regards to some of my research, and I was asking about this presentation, and both of them said, "Oh, yeah, you need to say something about the toxic masculinity," because a lot of these teenage boys are watching these. I think he had over 1 billion views globally on quite violent and kind of anti-feminine attitudes and kind of more extreme traditional male kind of views of what masculinity entails. And so in the research that I found, and there's not a lot on it, but those with more extreme kind of content that these kids are viewing, a lot of adolescents really aren't aware that it is extremist. And given the headlines and what we see on just the regular news, I can see why that would be hard to understand what would be considered extremist. But if you can't identify it, then you can't necessarily avoid it, and you may even take in more of it than you should. So that may be just a little bit of a warning, because a lot of these kids are not going to be going in very knowledgeable, and it may be their first kind of exposure to some of the attitudes that we devote towards women or devote towards particular religions or other things. So something to be aware about in regards to social media. So what do we do about this? You know, I've been chucking on more and more problems of social media and told you a little bit about advantages and what they're using. You know, your pediatric magazine JAMA came out and of course said for families, really, you know, try to establish some screen-free times and places. Now you notice it does not say banning. Banning is just going to be very unpopular, but I think a lot of kids would be open to having that parent kind of set a boundary, and that way they can disengage from even something that maybe they're not finding all that enjoyable, but somehow because of the anxiety of missing out or something else, feel just compelled to keep using. And so I think this is, you know, let the parent be the bad guy, but they're secretly relieved that they don't have to be on it all the time. Curfew for turning off the devices and probably having those devices in a common area that the kids can't access after that time, I think is a really good idea. It should help make it better or easier to fall asleep and not kind of be extended late into the night. Really doing some information or internet safety about what sharing personal information online looks like. So, you know, I'm a big advocate. Parents need to start very early. They don't need to be showing up on your doorstep or mine when they're adolescents with a bunch of these issues and already have had 5 years of, you know, unadulterated access to the internet and social media. But of course, parents, kids go by what they see, not exactly what their parents say. So if the parents are on it all the time, you know, that's also sending a different message than trying to set limits. So maybe as a family, working out ways to figure out how to do family activities instead of all being online. Another thing is trying to start early with monitoring. That's really gotten hard. I liked it when I was first starting out, and the advice was put your computer in the middle of the kind of living room, dining room where everyone can kind of see what they're doing. And that was great advice then, but everything's so mobile now, you know, how are you going to do that? And even if you could, would you even see what they were doing? Because the screens are so much smaller. But the very early, I mean, I'm talking 5, 6 years old, starting with media content, you know, and talking about things that they are watching and, you know, having them educate you on what they're watching, and so that you can kind of join them, and then educating them on what purposes this media might provide, I think is a really good starting point, because having that open communication as parents with their children about what they're viewing, and knowing that if they tell their parents what they're doing, that the parent's not going to freak out, take away their phone and do all of that, but rather really discuss with them and how's the best way to proceed when you see stuff like this. And, you know, that's what's going to happen. But you have to start early for that connection to be made. And unfortunately, if you've got a third of 8-year-olds already having their own smartphone, you got to start at 5 and 6, and really talking in their own language, in a language that they're going to understand. You know, like sometimes people aren't very nice to one another. They'll say very mean and hurtful things, and other ways of explaining some of the behaviors of the internet, you know, and the fact that we don't do those sorts of things on the internet or in social media, even if we see that with others, and trying to attempt to kind of minimize that to some degree. The American Academy of Pediatrics came out with a family media plan on healthychildren.org, which is a terrific website, by the way. Lots of good advice, you know, of course, with medical issues, but also with a lot of social issues. And social media, they've come up with this family media use plan. I think it's been well done. There's the link there, but you can see some of the things. It's really just a guide for families to kind of work through, you know, what is a good media balance? How much should we use online? How should we behave online as far as showing empathy and kindness to others? What about digital privacy and safety? You know, when are times and places that we should not have screens, like, you know, for instance, the kitchen table when we're eating, we shouldn't have people on. And what are appropriate content to search out there versus more inappropriate content, which we need to be aware of. Serious internet issues, these are things that, you know, where you may really have internet addiction issues that follow all of the common definitions of addiction. There isn't as much research because there's still some debate, even though I believe internet addiction or internet gaming disorder is one of the more experimental disorders or ones to keep eyes on for the DSM updates. So it's out there, and what they're seeing intervention-wise, things like cognitive behavioral therapy can work, as can group counseling. Sports intervention, I think, is just kind of getting them used to the idea of doing alternate behaviors and away from the internet. And then there's even internet-based interventions for these kind of gaming problems. Typically, they find that a combination of any of those four tend to work better than just any in isolation. And then the last thing I have is just a couple of resources in regards to those kind of digital guidelines. One from Common Sense Media, another one is a little bit more into the Cyberbullying Research Center and things about it. You also have your digital guidelines, and then finally, just a story I found in the Atlantic talking about, kids and parents regarding social media that I thought was fairly useful. So those, of course, will be available on handouts or on your slides. And so I was told to leave a little bit of time for questions. So I believe this is about the time frame. This is my contact information. If anybody does have questions or wants any follow-up, I'm more than happy to do that. So I'll leave that up a little bit there. As you can see with the big E, I'm with Eastern Kentucky University, a little south of the bigger blue nation in Lexington.
All right, thank you, Dr. Florell. That was very interesting. Couple questions. Can you define internet addiction?
As far as defining internet addiction, I think they're still debating as to the full definition. I think going back to, is this significantly interfering with other aspects of life, both socially, occupationally, or educationally? The idea that they kind of almost have a withdrawal from it if they are not using it, and then assorted maybe physical health issues too. That would be, the blurry eyes or eye strain, the postural sort of things that you might see. But I don't think there is a consensus as to the definition quite yet.
Okay. And can you talk about Finsta? Finsta?
So let's see, like Insta, I know is Instagram.
Oh.
So
okay. I guess, is that a fake Instagram? Do you know much about that?
well, I mean, I don't know of it being referred to that. I don't doubt it. I will be the first to admit the internet lingo changes so quickly that sometimes it's hard to keep track of it. But yes, there is. I was just reading the other day of these fake Instagram kind of accounts where people will kind of steal someone's identity in some ways and then present it as being from that person as a way of kind of setting up for cyberbullying, a way to kind of interfere or harass those individuals. And it's not limited to individuals. They have schools that are having these kind of fake Instagram or fake other accounts that are established. You even see it with teachers being targeted sometimes, where, especially if it's people who are a little older generation that are not on the platform, somebody might create one with their same name and then, borrow an image and create a fake account.
And then I guess, the questions our pediatricians would have is when exactly do we refer, and what can be managed at home?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
I'm sorry, when should the pediatricians refer the patients to psychology, and what percentage of this can be treated at home successfully?
So, that's kind of all that's great questions and hard ones to answer. I think if you have for referrals to psychologists, are you seeing the classic signs of what you would consider clinical levels of anxiety and depression? And I know with a pediatrician schedule, you're not going to have the 30 minutes to sit down and discuss, and you're certainly not going to have multiple sessions to be able to do that. So, the minute that you're starting to think that this goes beyond something that's very temporary, I would certainly refer to more mental health practitioners that can address it in a lot more detail and kind of get a fuller picture of things. And then the second part, what was that again?
What percentage successfully can be managed at home?
I think it really just depends on the problem. I think it also depends on the relationship that parent has with that child. If they seem to be pretty close and they have good communication styles, I think they can address an awful lot. It's when it maybe gets beyond, or the parent isn't having a good communication channel, or the child may not even feel comfortable communicating, like they were engaged in sexting, where it may be a lot more appropriate for a psychologist to be able to kind of work with them on that, because they're kind of a neutral party that the adolescent can maybe come out to and have a little bit more of a kind of good discussion, and not worry about some punitive aspect of disclosing things they maybe know they shouldn't have done, as adolescents do. And then of course they don't want to tell their parent, because they know that may mean various restrictions or other sorts of things that their parent would react to. So to give a percentage of that, I think a bulk of them probably can be done within the home, given some guidance. But there are going to be, I would say, a fairly high minority of cases that you're going to want to refer out to having a mental health therapist maybe be able to work with them.
And then with these disorders, what's the relapse percentage?
Well, I would say the relapse is dependent upon how frequently they get re-exposed to the exact same environment, right? It's just like substance abuse. What's the relapse rate? It's really high if you don't change anything about your environment. It's going to be lower if you have more supports in place. And so I would guess it would be fairly high, because the restrictions, to make, like, have it so that a child can't have a smartphone, that's the death knell for kids these days socially. And so going to that extreme, and yet if you allow them, they are very good at figuring out ways around things. And once again, you can go on YouTube to get advice if you don't know yourself. Apple just had to have a new update, because they figured out that some of the kids, like the restriction on time, you can put an app in that restricts time, but they figured out if you change the timing on the Apple phone, then it extends the time you can use the phone. And so I'm putting that out there because you can't do that anymore, right? So, don't have them get any ideas, but there's always going to be a way, and they have infinitely more time than parents to figure out that way. So my guess is it can get fairly high unless there's something really significant that happened, and maybe the adolescent themselves is willing to, make that change, versus it having been, kind of come down from on top or on high.
Okay. All right, Dr. Florell, that's our questions for today. We greatly appreciate you joining us. And thanks everyone else for joining us today. You'll receive an email with a link to an evaluation for CME credit after the completion today. And then join us next month for Pediatrics live stream on Wednesday, November 16th at noon. Dr. Amber Pendleton will discuss adverse childhood experiences. So thanks everyone for joining us, and have a good week.